Welcome, my name is Colleen Tauke and I'm a sewing specialist with Fons and Porter. In this Sew Easy tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make continuous bias binding. So in order to make bias binding, a lot of times we would take fabric and draw a diagonal and cut strips and join them together. Now, cutting like that gets to be kind of monotonous. There's a way to make it faster and more efficiently. Now, bias binding is usually used whenever we have a curved outer edge to our project. And you can see on the placemats behind me that they have curved corners. So therefore we were using bias binding so it will roll around and make a nice finished edge. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to start with a square of fabric, and we can make this entire thing into bias binding. What we need to do first is go to the back side, and we are going to you can mark a diagonal across the block, or you can just go in and cut it. So here, our mat is just about the right size. We're just going to be cutting this into two large triangles. Now I'm going to go in and draw a line just so that I know for sure that I'm straight, because I need to match and slide my ruler to the far end. There, I know I'm in the right place. And I will make a mark so that registration I can come back across. Don't want to go crooked. So corner to corner, I'm going to splice square into two large triangles. Now, in order to keep yourself oriented, a lot of times people start sliding these around and then they're thinking, where were my outer edges? So in our technique, we're just going to have you put a pin in each of the outer straight of grain edges so that you can kind of keep yourself oriented. And then these will be, without a pin, will be your bias edges. Okay, now what we need to do, let me move this one out. I had a spare one in case our ruler went south, is that we need to arrange our triangles to create this shape. Now you can see they're right sides together, and the diagonals are, I have to think about it now, this one stays here, and the other I'm going to take end for end. I'm going to lay this one on top. And you'll notice pins, pins, two pins match up here, and then my diagonals are overlapping in the center like that. And then what I want to do is come in and I want to create a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this edge. So we've got one here that's already done like that. You can see a 1/4 inch seam here. I'll take this one underneath. Now the diagrams in our patterns are really wonderful. So if you've gotten mixed up or not sure how that went, you can reference those diagrams. Now when you open this up, we will have a shape that looks like this. And you think, now what? Well, what we need to do is press the seam allowance. So we were going to want to open the seam allowance up to reduce the bulk. And so opening it up like this, kind of like in garment sewing. We don't open seams too often in quilting. Every once in a while people do. So you can score that with your finger, and then you can take it to the ironing board, and we will press the seam open. Make sure that you get that seam open all the way and don't leave like they call a false ditch. You want it to be nice and flat when you're done. And you can use steam if you like, or not. So you want to open that up and create a nice flat surface. Next, what we're going to be doing, and you have to remember the long edges were our bias cut, and if you need to look at it, you can see, if you look really close, you can see the intersection of the fibers, so you know this is your bias. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be drawing lines across the block. Take a ruler, and you can start at either side. It won't make a difference which side. And most of the time we're making binding that's 2 1/4 to 2 1/2 inches wide. So 2 1/4 inch is a very classic width on binding. So you can come in, now you have to make sure that you're marking all the way from edge to edge. So you may have to slide your ruler to get all the way across the block. But we're going to drop in using your favorite marking tool. This could be a pencil, it could be a fabric pen. It's going to be a cutting line. So we're going to go across the block all the way, and you're going to create ladder marks all the way, and I have one already marked. So it takes a while to do all the marking, but it's well worth it. I have one here marked and ready to go. Now you can use any size. We have a chart that comes with the bias binding, continuous bias binding reference, so you'll know how many yards of continuous bias you can make off of different size squares, because you could start with an 18, a 27, a 36-inch square, just depending on how many yards or feet of binding that you actually need to make. Now in this case, as I marked off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strips, I did end up with some waste, so there's a small piece there that won't be used. But now what I need to do is to realign this so that I can create one more seam. And what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to pick up in the center here. And people think, oh, if I were to seam this together, that would be great, and I could match up those seams. But if you were to seam this together, you would create a tube so that you would have rings coming off. And you say, why? How does she know that? Because she's done that before. I misaligned it and ended up cutting off a tube and went, that's not what I wanted. What I want is to be able to cut this into a spiral, which means then that I need to offset the seams by 1. So what I need to do is slide it offset like this so that the seams then match up here. And so what I will do then is pick these up. And it's best to lay it so it actually makes sense to you and pin right through a 1/4 inch down from the cut edge, then put your pin through, and I came pretty close. Hit the marked line on the back side. And you want to do that at each of your intersections. So approximately a 1/4 inch from the cut edge to the marked line, and do that again on the back side. And I'm not quite on that one, so slide it down till you hit that one. And you'll do that the entire length of this piece. Now, if you were making a quilt that had a scalloped outer edge, that's the time you're going to make a bias binding. Or if you're making, say, a Christmas tree skirt, and it is circular on the outer edge, this is a time for bias binding. If you were to try and put traditional binding on an edge like that, you will have more than a headache trying to get it to round and be smooth on each of the intersections. Or each of the curves, I should say. So just drop the last pin in place, and then we are ready to sew. Now take this over, and it will seem kind of awkward. It seems a little messy, but that's what it's supposed to look like. Now we're going to go in and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and slide it under the sewing machine. Now here I'm using red thread, which actually does match the project, but if you were using a light fabric, light thread, again, match. We tend to use red thread just so that the camera can pick it up and make it easier for you to see. Just take out your pins as you approach each of them so that it doesn't stretch and distort. Okay, almost across. And then we'll actually do a cut, and you'll see the yardage of continuous bias that we can create. Okay. Now, if I were to put my hand in here, it's a tube, but it's just an offset tube at this point. So now I can come in, and it's time to take out your scissors. We use rotary cutter all the time, but this is a point where you're going to be using your scissors. And you're going to come in, get started, and you're going to follow that marked line that you created. And as you cut, you'll realize that you're actually doing a corkscrew. It's just going to be continuous and one long piece. There are some seam allowances that you're going to have, but if you're having to create, say, 5 or 6 yards of bias, this is a lot easier than having to put together a bunch of little seams end-to-end pieces, if you've ever tried to do it that way. When you do get to that last seam that you put in, you will want to go in and, forgot that, press your seam allowance open to make it lay flat. Okay. On a solid color binding like this, you don't see the seam allowances as much. When you're using a patterned fabric, sometimes you'll see your seam allowances a little bit more, but they tend to blend in. Okay, if I were just keep cutting, you'll notice I'll just keep making more and more bias binding like this. For more of our Sew Easy tutorials, visit our website. Thanks for joining me today.